morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dipanjan Chaudhury. I'm a senior assistant editor with Economic Times, and I'll be moderating this session on a very interesting topic. The Ananta Aspen Center is hosting a series of webinars on COVID-19 and the world order to reach out to a larger segment of society to bring them up to date on the complex, diverse, and the changing international scenario. So today we are here to discuss a very interesting topic on Myanmar's China dilemma. There have been reports that the all-powerful general of Myanmar have been expressing their displeasure to various public forums, both within the country as well as abroad, on the duplicity by the Chinese Communist Party on supporting the peace process on one hand and as well as supporting arming the rebels. To discuss this, we are delighted to have India's two top diplomats who have both served in Myanmar as High Commissioners. We have Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, who has been India's High Commissioner to Myanmar between 2013 and 16. He has an illustrious career. He was earlier India's High Commissioner to an equally important country in India's neighborhood in Afghanistan. And prior to that, he had served in an important country before the Arab Spring broke out in Syria. He has an illustrious career, having served in Europe, in UN, and takes a lot of interest in the current dynamics in Myanmar, which are unfolding. We have delighted to also join by Ambassador G. Parthasarathy, who probably needs no introduction to this audience. He was India's High Commissioner in Myanmar prior to his stint in our neighbor Pakistan. Ahead of that, he was India's High Commissioner to Australia and Cyprus. And he has been a spokesperson to one of our former prime ministers and currently Chancellor of the Jammu University, and has helped in curating Sardar Patel Museum. Welcome, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. Welcome, Ambassador Parthasarathy. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, we can start with you. You present your views on what you think is happening in Myanmar.
Okay, may I begin?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. I would like to thank Kiran Prasricha and the Ananta Aspen Center for organizing and inviting me to this event. Ambassador G. Parthasarathy, my respected senior, for agreeing to join this panel, and Dipanjan, you for your initiative and management of this event, as well, of course, the eminent participants, guests, and friends who are present for this webinar. So it's a pleasure for me to share some thoughts with you on the subject of today's discussion, which is Myanmar's China's dilemma. Myanmar's China's dilemma is not unique to Myanmar. In fact, many countries, India included, share that in some form or the other. And I think it's become particularly sort of significant and acute as China seems to deviate, if not jettison, its peaceful rise for a more assertive and of late an aggressive posture. Of course, the core of this dilemma is that everybody needs China. Everybody needs China as a source of manufactured goods and increasingly high-tech services, manufactured goods ranging from the low to the high-tech, tech services also catering to the lower segment of the market, all the way up to the 5G. But also, over the period of time, it has emerged as not just an economic competitor to the leading manufacturing nations, but also a technological competitor. Perhaps not quite there at the same level as the most advanced countries in the world, but definitely knocking on the door. And of course, a striking ability to use asymmetry to its advantage. Now, the core of the challenge is, how do you benefit from China's growing economy and influence in some cases without losing strategic autonomy and control? And I think that's the kind of problem that Myanmar has been grappling with its own characteristics. I mean, one characteristic is, of course, simply the size and differential, map one. And there you will see that essentially Myanmar is China is about 14 times in terms of size of Myanmar, 28 times in terms of population, and in terms of GDP, Myanmar's GDP is about 70 billion, China's GDP is closing on 15 trillion. So we are talking perhaps of a 20-fold or more than 20-fold GDP differential. And while we are at it, let me just also get rid of one more statistic, which is the trade and investment statistics. And I'll compare the trade and investment statistics of both China as well as India and Thailand. So China's trade, formal trade, in fact, informal trade maybe considerably more, stands at about 12 billion. I think if we include informal trade, it's likely to be closer to 20 billion. Its investments, if we include Hong Kong, are in the range of 25 billion. India, by comparison, its trade at its most has been 2 billion, and its investment are somewhere in the range of 750 billion. So there's practically no comparison. And when we compare it with Thailand, even Thailand is much more. Thailand's trade, of course, a lot of it also has to do with oil and gas, is about 6 billion, and its investment is about 10 billion. And then you have other countries. You know, at the time of the transition in 2011, India was the third largest trade partner of Myanmar. In spite of all the difficulties, pro-democracy agitation, international sanctions, expulsion of Indians or other squeezing out of Indians during Nevin's time, India was the third largest trading partner. Today, it has slipped to about fifth because newer players have entered the market. I mean, Japan is one, South Korea is there, even Vietnam and other ASEAN countries are competing for that space. So one is the size differential, but actually more than the size differential, I would say it is the development deficit. I think Myanmar, over the course of its history, has been quite adept at keeping the Chinese back, particularly during the Qing period, when Beijing or when the Qing emperors were bearing down very heavily on the Konbaung dynasty. This was in the 18th century. In fact, the Burmese rulers were quite successful in keeping them off them. This has changed, of course, a lot more now. But the development deficit is important because I think Myanmar's focus ever since its independence has been much more on national unity. And therefore, if you see the revolution, two or three things strike. Firstly, you know, right from the beginning, they were much more preoccupied with insurgencies, both left-wing insurgencies as well as ethnic insurgencies. And the Karen insurgency practically reached Yangon. And in fact, India, it was India who helped at that point in being able to drive the Karens back from that area. But even after that, I mean, the Burmese road to socialism, which, by the way, the socialist world, including China, did not accept as truly socialist because it was really more, at the core, more nationalist in nature, was an absolute disaster for the economy. Myanmar, which had been actually, or Yangon in particular, which had been effectively the Bangkok of Southeast Asia of that time, and Yangon Rangoon University, which was effectively the leading university of Southeast Asia, even including Singapore at that particular point of time. You know, all of these just disappeared. I mean, Myanmar went 50 years back. The military rulers, their focus, and this is evident in the names of their parties, the SLOC was focused on law and order, a euphemism for national unity. The State Peace and Development Party, the SPDP, also prioritized peace, which was again a euphemism for national unity, over development. In fact, development only then enters the vocabulary. And the USDP, the Union Social Solidarity and Development Party, too, solidarity was also another word for national unity. So the preoccupation of the military regimes and the governments in Myanmar right from the beginning has been on national unity, law and order, and the insurgencies, and development has generally suffered. Therefore, when Myanmar opened up, what it most required was to catch up with its fellow ASEAN countries in terms of the development deficit. For that, it required large amounts of investment. Now, the fact is that investments also into Myanmar, in spite of it being a naturally bountiful and resourceful country, investments also were limited for two reasons. One is that on account of its own inability to handle its domestic problems dealing with its population. First, it was the foreigners, primarily Indians and Chinese, which was the primary reason for the nationalization of industries in Burma. Then it was the pro-democracy agitation. And third, it was the Rohingya agitation. So all these three domestic problems, in fact, led to international scrutiny, international sanction, punitive sanctions, which effectively, in the latter two cases, in the case of 1988 and 2017, pushed Myanmar into Chinese hands. So I think this is the background that's peculiar to Myanmar, that it required investments in terms of development, but at the same time was closed off to international investments and relations, except for the USDP period, and of course the period that is now. And all this basically resulted in a kind of sense of loss of control. that Myanmar, a country with its sort of Burma heartland, quite ethnocentric in its own way, quite nationalist in its own way, strongly resistant of Chinese power influence historically, felt itself trapped into a relationship of into an unequal relationship and a relationship of power. And I would like to raise two questions, which maybe we can discuss, which are more of a general nature. Whether, without succumbing to essentialist or essentially cultural theories or rationale for Chinese behavior, whether there's something inherent in China's attitude towards the rest of the world that creates this kind of sense of dependence and sense of frustration and pushback. And I'll give two possible examples of this. One is, of course, as a friend of mine used to say, the Chinese are masters of cultivating an inbuilt tension in even their closest of relations. So an element of power is inbuilt even in their closest of relations, an element of power that they can turn on and off, relax and tighten as they wish. And the second question is whether these relations have typically been equal relations or unequal relations. This is a bit ironic, given the fact that in a way, a lot of China's history starts off from the unequal treaties. But the reality is that in many of its relations, it has a problem with dealing with other countries equally. And in a sense, one of its problems with the US is here is a country that is more equal than it. And one of its problems with India is India that claims to be equal or has aspirations to be treated equally as an Asian power, but lacks the power metrics. So these are just two discussion points I wanted to leave. Now I'll come to really what I consider to be the strategic weight of China in Myanmar and how it has been able to exercise its levers. I think primarily they are threefold, and I'll quickly dispose of two of them because I think they're fairly obvious and concentrate a little bit on the economic relationship. One is political. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the ethnic armed insurgencies, the ethnic armed organizations, the insurgencies, and particularly the insurgencies that are on China's border, many of them are in fact ethnic Chinese insurgencies. When we are talking about the Wa and the Mangla and the Kokang, the ethnic Chinese, there are others that are not, like the Kachins, the Shan, and also the Palong, the TNLA, and the Arakan. So many of these ethnic insurgencies are very closely tied to China. Maybe not officially, maybe not necessarily to the central government. Very often they can be regional and local interests in Yunnan, which is their joining province. And these have played a big role. I mean, the role of weapons is well known, but even politically, we can see China's sort of tactic of being able to tighten and loosen its control over its relations with Myanmar by increasing or at times resolving or appearing to resolve, at least taking one step to resolve, sometimes bringing the ethnic armed insurgents to the negotiating table when they have been refusing to do so otherwise. So one instrument has simply been the insurgencies. And in fact, right now, the major groups that are fighting the Myanmar government are highly dependent on the Chinese, directly or indirectly, mostly indirectly. And there's quite a lot of evidence of that. The second is, of course, geopolitical. The fact of the matter, as I mentioned, the sanctions. Sanctions have thrown Myanmar into Chinese hands. And China has used that adroitly, I would say, in order to realize its strategic ambitions. The strategic ambitions are both geopolitical and geoeconomic. At the geopolitical level, their basic game is that Myanmar should be on their side, show it due deference, show it due respect, and essentially do what it wants to, keep them on their side, and definitely, even if it means there is a space for being neutral, definitely not on the side of the West and its allies in Asia, including Japan. And the second sort of objective that it has there is that it would like to, and the second objective is that in the end, it would like access to the Bay of Bengal, both for economic reasons and political reasons. The economic reasons are simply this: maritime access, energy access, raw material access to its southern provinces, particularly the booming Yunnan province, and also access to the Bay of Bengal in both in terms of as a secondary exit bypassing the Malacca dilemma to the Bay of Bengal, and eventually to have a shipping and naval presence, a two-ocean shipping and naval presence, including in the Indian Ocean region. So, in effect, it would like to be able to dictate Myanmar's foreign policy to keep it on its side rather than the other side in order for these geopolitical and geo-economic objectives. Now, I will now focus a little bit on how it has tried to use its investments in particular in terms of being able to further this objective. Actually, most of these investments have really begun in the post-2000 era. They started off with, and this was the time that China started to grow, or at least began to really grow. This was the post-Deng Xiaoping era. And this was also the period, by the way, that the Myanmar military rulers, in particular Than Shwe, started making his first moves towards India as well. So this was the time that the big sort of investment projects like the Mitson hydroelectric power project and dam, that was conceived or started sometime around 2006. So essentially, what has happened is these have all got subsumed under what China calls BRI, but BRI is a very amorphous concept. In the BRI, we have projects that are official and unofficial. There are projects that are predate the BRI in terms of its conception that have been brought into it. But the core project is the CMEC, which is the China-Myanmar Economic. Can you show that slide with the oil pipeline? Right. So the core of this is the CMEC. Now the CMEC consists of a number, no, the other one, the previous one. The core of this is there are pre-existing oil and gas pipelines that were put into operation between 2015 and 16. In 2016, during the transition period from the USDP government to the MLD government, China was awarded the special economic zone, development of the special economic zone at Chawphu, which you see at the bottom of the. So in effect, Chawphu would then connect through the oil and gas pipelines to Kunming. And together with the SEZ, they also got the Chawphu deep sea port. Now the Chawphu deep sea port has been known from at least the early 20th century to be possibly the best deep sea natural harbor in the Bay of Bengal. And in fact, the Chinese possibly had a lock on this. It was simply not offered to anyone during the period of their independence, starting from the 1980s. When, after the pro-democracy agitation and the international sanctions, Myanmar was literally thrown into Chinese hands. So now what we have is we have an oil pipeline, we have a gas pipeline, we have a special economic zone, and we have a deep sea port. And to this, China is adding a number of other investments in the border areas. If you see towards the Yunnan area, they are developing 3 border special economic cooperation zones. One at Muse, literally where the line crosses, and one a little further east at a place called Chinsei Ho, and a third one, which is further up towards the north at a place called Kampetki. So these are the sort of major investments there. And these are all official investments, but they're also now trying to add on connectivity projects. So you have infrastructure projects, port projects, you have industrial projects coming up at the border, and now you have connectivity projects that include a Mandalay Muse railway line, a Mandalay Muse expressway, and a Chawphu Naypyidaw highway. And an arm of that corridor goes southwards to Yangon, where in Yangon they have a big development project, city development project called the Yangon City Development Project. But aside from these major projects that are part of the CMEC and officially part of the BRI, there are a number of other projects. Some are in private, some are state-owned, and some are in the gray zone, where in fact there is a relationship between the two. And these cover real estate, these cover plantation agriculture, these cover a number of other industrial zones that are scattered at different parts. But most of all, they're concentrated in the boundary areas, whether it is in the north, including, for example, now they have an industrial zone, a private industrial zone coming up in Michina. They already have one planned at Mandalay. There is one that has been controversial, one that has come up at Miyawadi on the Thai border. And these should be seen as part of its extended BRI network all over Southeast Asia. All over Southeast Asia includes Boten, Mohan Boten, which is on the Laos-Yunnan border. Sihanouk Will, which is being developed as a tourist casino, gambling, and real estate development project, but which will probably in future serve the Kra Canal. But also several other projects. You have all the north-south corridors, the Kunming-Singapore railway line, the East Coast railway line. So you have a number of projects that basically link Yunnan with the south from Sihanouk Will through Malaysia to Singapore to Chofu on the Bay of Bengal. And of course, we all know what China is doing towards the west of India. So I think that is the general map that I would like to leave you with one last comment, that at the face of it, a lot of this seems very overbearing. But the fact of the matter is that Myanmar has been able to push back. A lot of these projects that we are talking about are still in the drawing board. A lot of them are still in feasibility studies. When Xi Jinping visited Myanmar in January 2020, he was able to sign only 3 agreements, and none of them was strategically significant, except for one which was a kind of MOU on the CMEC going up to 2030. So what we are seeing is that by no means is Myanmar a pushover. By no means is Myanmar a sellout. There is a very deep well of of suspicion of China's intentions. There is a degree of resistance of China. There is resentment about what is seen as Chinese demographic intrusion. There is resentment at the kind of dependencies that China has been trying to create, and the kind of megaphone diplomacy that it has been trying to do on things like Mitso. Lest I have exaggerated the extent of economic penetration of China into Myanmar, let me just end with this word that a lot of these are still in the planning stage. There is a tussle going on. I remember a very senior minister told me at the time of the transition from the USDP to the NLD that let's see her handling the Chinese. The USDP had been very good at keeping the Chinese off balance. And as they handed over Chokfu to the NLD government, they posed this challenge, whether she would be able to resist Chinese pressure. In spite of the kind of efforts that China has made to woo Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, on the whole, Myanmar has been quite reserved in accepting Chinese pressures. So I'll leave it at that. And pardon me if I have exceeded my time. Thank you.
Welcome, Ambassador Parthasarathy. Yeah.
Thank you, Dipanjan, and thank you, Gautam, for joining me on this occasion. Kiran and Harshit from the Aspen, old friends and guides and philosophers as far as I'm concerned over the years. It's always a delight to be with Aspen talking on Myanmar. Now, I spent well over 3 years there, and let me tell my Myanmar friends, it was one of the most enjoyable postings I had in life. Because we were dealing with genuine people. I mean, Myanmar was then under the rule of the military totally, but one could sense that there would be an element of democracy coming in. There was a lot of concern about the growing Chinese influence, but I regarded it as natural because I thought the policy of the West, particularly led by the United Kingdom, the UK just messes around a bit too much in its former colonies. And I felt that they were too intrusive on Myanmar. And frankly, we could at best, I would naturally prefer a fully democratically elected government in Myanmar, but it's for the people of Myanmar to decide. They have to sort it out within themselves. As I see it and as we see it, there has been steady progress towards the process of democratization. We hope that would become irreversible. But given the ethnic conflicts that Myanmar has, there is also a degree of support, I think, for the army's role in holding the country together. Because no country has faced internal insurgencies to the extent that Myanmar has. And I want to say that when the Karens were entering Yangon in 1949, it was weapons shipped from India which helped the Myanmar army to push them back. That didn't leave us as great favorites with the Karens, but they are on the borders of Thailand, not on India's borders. So one thing Myanmar is very clear about, we want a united Myanmar with a progressive move towards democracy to be determined at a pace they want. Coming to external relations, I don't blame Myanmar for the pace with which they went, or literally were driven into the arms of the Chinese. Even the Japanese had to be sensitive to American concerns, and therefore moved slowly towards Myanmar. The Koreans were pretty open, but then the Koreans were primarily a commercial engagement there. And I think where everybody missed out was, and I think we are still missing out, the crucial role of Vietnam. And I think the rail we envisaged to Vietnam, the rail line, should be remembered and gone through. Because as I see it, I see a hegemonic China, a Sino-centric China, as they call it, which believes that the world revolves around the Middle Kingdom, trying to dominate Asia and the world. And powers which have, and I must say, I see a very clear difference between the modesty shown by Deng Xiaoping, who's really the builder of modern China and perhaps the greatest leader China has had for over a century, where he cared for neighbors like Myanmar. He stopped this fiddling around with ethnic groups in Myanmar. And now they're back in it, whether it is the Karens, whether it is the United Vast State Army, which is as good as the army of most African states, and now the Arakan Army, which operates both on our borders. And I think these are, I regard them as proxies of China. United Vast State Army operates openly under the eyes of the Chinese government. And what has intrigued me is the extent to which Myanmar is accepting a Chinese role in its internal affairs. I would never want to interfere in the internal affairs of Myanmar. If Myanmar asks us for help or information on how we run our democracy, yes. But the way the Chinese ambassador and functionaries in the neighboring province behave as though they are super governors in dealing with these issues, I think that will have its own impact on Myanmar public opinion. If I was a Myanmar citizen, I wouldn't be happy with somebody doing that in my country. Dealing with armed insurgents groups, the United Vast State Army is almost a full-fledged army. And where do the Kachins get their arms from? They go just across the border to the Yunnan province. And we know exactly what happens in the Yunnan province. And now the Chinese are doing it blatantly and openly. So my worry on the internal front is leave it to Myanmar, if as long as it was left to Myanmar. And therefore it would be better. And therefore I think India and all of us needs to also tell the West that cool it, Myanmar will move to democracy at a pace that Myanmar wants. Aung San Suu Kyi is, a worthy daughter of her father, but that is something for Myanmar to decide. And really, Indian diplomacy should focus much more in persuading the Americans and the others. Hey, you're dealing with the Chinese, one-party dictatorship. President Trump seems to love Kim Jong-un of North Korea. What's the problem with dealing with Myanmar? I think India's role should be to see that Myanmar has many friends. I don't mind their having a Chinese friend, but Chinese exclusivism with them interfering in their internal affairs, with their determining what should happen on their borders with India. I want to tell my Myanmar friends that is one objective we have in mind. What sort of relationship? Defense relationship? You need weapons? Please, that's your choice. I'm happy you're getting the Indian submarine soon enough, and it will be the first Indian contribution. We had made some contribution, but it was limited. because by inclination, we are modest in our arms sales. So if you ask me our priorities with Myanmar, a stable Myanmar-India border, and I can assure my Myanmar friends, our army guys really love their counterparts. The best relationship we have with any military in our neighborhood is with the Myanmar army. It is the closest because we work for each other and think for each other. That is the important part of the relationship with Myanmar. I don't find it in our relationship with other neighboring countries at all, where there is an adversarial element, the India factor and so on, but it does not exist. And also, of course, our Chinese friends are very helpful to us in building our relationships, so they believe. The fact of the matter is that we have in India, we have to bear this, and the world will have to recognize this, that the Indian-Myanmar relationship is built not on a complementary of economics, but of strengthening each other's unity and territorial integrity. That is the basis of the Indian-Myanmar relationship. And I think we are proceeding ahead well with it. As I said, with the West, we should persuade the Americans to keep the British out of the loop and keep the Germans and the French, so that you have a normally, so that Myanmar can develop a balanced relationship and also follow the world trends of opening out more and more to democracy. That is a world trend. But India is not forcing it down anybody. That's for them to decide. Coming to the region, I think ASEAN, I won't name the members, with some very willing members who are apologists for China, are going down under Chinese influence. China has maritime boundary problems with a number of ASEAN countries. Yet it took about 10 years for them to unite and even pass a small resolution asking China to respect the UN Conference on the Law of the Seas. That is carrying things too far. As I said, I hope defense cooperation will go. And I think BIMSTEC now should focus more on maritime cooperation in the Bay of Bengal. Certainly, because we are both members, you're getting a submarine. I think India should be providing more patrol boats and other things to you. We are not in the business of using, Myanmar for our advantage, but really to make it a partner along with Indonesia. Frankly, I am looking at Indonesia developing a close relationship with the Quad, particularly for safeguarding the Straits of Malacca. That is something we need to look at. If Myanmar is willing to join in any form, that's for Myanmar to decide. We're not getting into it. We realize their compulsions. But really, the security of the Bay of Bengal, up to the Straits of Malacca, beyond the Cocos Islands, owned by Myanmar, is something we would like Myanmar to join in with us, Indonesians and the others. That would be something quite important we need to do. I want to say this, that as I see it, with the help, with the Chinese playing around with insurgent groups, I would, as a friend, tell Myanmar, please be very careful in how they get themselves into their reconciliation they're seeking with ethnic minorities. I noticed the Chinese seem a bit too keen. In our case, what we have said is, whatever the Myanmar government wants in drafting a more federal structure, India would help. But we are not going to get directly involved in that. It will depend on what China wants, or what Myanmar wants, and the ethnic group want. Have I got another 5 minutes? Or
we will now have a moderated discussion. Ambassador Parthasarathy, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya.
Yeah, please.
I would request the audience to start sending in their questions and not wait till the end. Ambassador Parthasarathy, if I can just touch on a very recent interview by the Myanmar's top general. And interestingly, the interview was given in Moscow while he was on a visit there to a Russian newspaper. What do you make of this? You know, he did not name China, but media reports
Hello?
pointed out. So why in Moscow that he made this comment and to a Russian newspaper?
Dipanjan, let me make one point. At this very same conference, where Myanmar's senior most general referred to external interference and so on, at that very same conference, at a time when there were tensions on the China-India border, Russia publicly agreed to an Indian request for fighter aircraft and weapons and ammunition. I think the Russians also are feeling uneasy. I recall when I was in Moscow in the 1970s, there was a bloody battle in the Ussuri River. And at that time, the Soviet Union was very powerful. And I can also tell you here, during the 1971 conflict in Bangladesh, right on Myanmar's borders, the Russians had told China not to interfere, and in fact deployed several divisions on China's border then in Kazakhstan. So there is a history of the Russians doing this because they have seen what the Russians used to call as Great Han chauvinism, which is China becoming chauvinistic and nationalistic. They regard that as a danger to their security. So I think we have to bear all this in mind. And certainly if you take, don't miss another factor. Myanmar, China likes to be the exclusive military partner. The Russians are giving them the sort of weapons they want, including fighter aircraft. So I think the Russian attitude should never be ignored in this. And in fact, I would hope that we are presenting this larger Asian picture, because frankly, we would be quite happy if ASEAN can remain as independent as they were. But if ASEAN countries get scared to even talk of the judgment of a UN tribunal based on international law, and you have apologists within ASEAN pushing that cause, there is obviously, as far as China is concerned, not respect, but fear. And relationships run by fear have their own limitations. Lastly, I know I don't have to caution my Myanmar friends, but look, we have carried out studies of Chinese relations with everybody from the coast of Africa across to the Pacific. In every case, the Chinese have given loans in such large quantities and that you are unable to repay. And when that happens, the Chinese take over your territory, like in Hambantota. They're trying it in Mombasa and Kenya. So I think the fact of the matter is, and they won't succeed. I can see already sensing in Africa, in the east coast of Africa, this. Lastly, you can enter into a great relationship with Iran. I don't believe that the West should be imposing sanctions on Iran. But then large-scale nature of that has its implications for the Arab Gulf countries. And therefore, I think we should watch all this. I hope Myanmar does. And I think in the case of Myanmar, greater cooperation in BIMSTEC, much greater. I was there when the military chiefs met. More often, naval chiefs should meet. And we should have it when Myanmar has its submarine. And we should also cooperate more with Myanmar on the field of coastal security for them. That's it. And Chokfu remains a source of interest.
Mr. Mukhopadhaya, if I could refer to a very recent article which came out on Saturday by the Charge d'Affaires of the US Embassy, George Shibley, and he spoke about the Chinese trying to, infringe on the sovereignty of its neighbors. Interestingly, it was a Charge d'Affaires in Myanmar writing in their English newspaper it was not written in Vietnam, not written in Indonesia. Why do you think, the Americans chose to write in, in a newspaper in Myanmar?
Very likely they have taken note of General Min Aung Hlaing's statement about foreign interference. There is nothing specific. I think this is part of the US pushback on China that we have seen. I think it's a kind of system-wide, all of government approach that the United States seems to have evolved. And I think this was really very well articulated by their National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, at a lecture in Arizona, where they more or less drew what was, I think they've abandoned this whole idea that their relationship with China can be a cooperative relationship. They've kind of acknowledged that this is essentially going to be a competitive relationship. In that competitive relationship, as we all know that in many ways they are looking at Asia. They are seeing the whole series of problems. I think ultimately the focus of this is on Taiwan, but going backwards, it includes what they are really interested in, which is the status of Hong Kong, the situation in the South China Sea, and of course what we are seeing in the Himalayas is an adjunct of it, and what we are seeing in Myanmar is also an adjunct of it. So, as I said, and I also said the methodology of that, China is deeply involved. If it's an open secret in the ethnic armed organizations and insurgencies in Myanmar, all the major ethnic armed groups that are still fighting the government are all known to be close to China or dependent on China. But I would also say this one thing, that most of the Chinese ethnic groups are not just simply, cat's paws, or not just simply, they have their own interests. So in many ways, this kind of nationalist sentiment that we talk about within Myanmar also applies to many of the ethnic groups. So it is not that all of them will necessarily just comply with anything that China wants. There are internal frictions amongst them as well. Maybe apart from those ethnic Chinese groups, as Ambassador Parthasarathy mentioned, in particular the Wa State Army. The Wa State Army is virtually an instrument of China in Myanmar. And many others are also being instruments. But whether they will actually become instruments against third countries is something that we have to keep an open mind on. I would say that these are, as again Ambassador Parthasarathy said, we have to engage with these ethnic groups, the political groups, not necessarily the militant groups, to as part of a larger Myanmar relationship. And most probably the hint at Myanmar in an English newspaper came because they detected this opening provided by General Min Aung Hlaing.
Mr. Mukhopadhaya, when you talk about the ethnic groups, there is one ethnic group which has armed itself in the recent years, is ARSA. And there are reports that ARSA has developed links over a period with our western neighbor, Pakistan. And this has also complicated the Rohingya issue. It's not just a political issue, it's just become a security challenge for India, for Bangladesh, as well as for Myanmar. Why do you see the road ahead for the Rohingyas issue? What
road ahead? Well, extremely difficult to see a road ahead. There's no doubt that ARSA has been trying to tap sort of wider jihadi sentiments and sort of larger jihadi international organizations, though their focus really is on the predicament and the situation of the Rohingyas. I think what the Myanmar army has done in Rakhine State, which is effectively to push as many of the Rohingyas out. I don't see them in short order taking them back. It is not just a Myanmar military action. Myanmar's military's action is widely supported by public sentiment and nationalist sentiment within Myanmar. I'm not saying it is right or wrong. What happens is the Rohingya suffer from a number of, it's like a double or a triple jeopardy. Firstly, they suffer from being racially different and not being acknowledged to be one of the recognized so-called races of Myanmar. Second, they claim to be, and I think this is the part that Myanmar finds most difficult, they claim to be indigenous. Unlike the other people of Indic origin that have settled in Myanmar, that includes many of the other Indian communities, they have never claimed indigeneity. Now, the Rohingya claim is plausible. I think this is something that has to be discussed. And the third thing is that it also taps into a latent anti-Muslim feeling. And that latent anti-Muslim feeling is something that goes back practically a millennia, to the advent of Islam, when actually Islam was seen as having pushed Buddhism out of, let's say, South Asia. And in many ways, at the back of a lot of Myanmar Buddhists' mind, they are the kind of vanguard or defender of this kind of. So there are very deep sentiments, which are, of course, very questionable, but there are deep sentiments that animate this. So I don't really see a long-term solution to this. I don't see public sentiment in Myanmar welcoming the Rohingya back. That means they are likely to remain in Bangladesh for a long time unless a resettlement program is started. A resettlement program will be seen as rewarding Myanmar's so-called, as you know, the case of genocide or at least ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. And I don't see the world ready to do that. And of course, it will always keep a simmering jihad, and there will always be the simmering jihadi links. It all depends on whether international jihadi organizations start cashing in on this phenomenon, particularly in the refugee camps near Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, because it's really it's a no-go situation where they can't go back, they can't go ahead. They are literally in a cesspool where they are extremely susceptible to frustration, demoralization, and radicalism. And I think we should be prepared for anything to come out of that hot pot.
I'm now opening it to the Q&A sessions. We have another 12 minutes with us in the session. There is one question from Mr. Bupul Chatterjee, who's the Executive Director of CUTS International. He has asked whether Bangladesh, India, Myanmar can form a sub-regional group. I guess he was asking, sub-region out of the BIMSTEC. And what is the role of Bangladesh in India-Myanmar relations? Mr. Parthasarathy, would you like to take it up?
We try to keep the two separate compartments, our bilateral with Myanmar and our bilateral with Bangladesh. The factor we really have bringing us together is BIMSTEC. And frankly, I'm a bit disappointed at the pace with which economic integration is proceeding in BIMSTEC, because we have free trade arrangements with all BIMSTEC members. They're either SAARC or ASEAN, but the others don't have with each other. So I think economically integrating it is very important. Secondly, on the case of the Rohingyas, really, I would ask about my friends from Western countries, as I agree with my colleague Gautam, that it's a very complex problem. And there's no use being judgmental on either. Each one has his own strong case. But at least one could expect greater assistance provided to Bangladesh and to others for resettling these refugees pending repatriation. And I think I would also appeal to my own friends in Myanmar that it will do their country's image a great deal of good if a few thousand of them returned. And really, if we can all work together to make that happen, I'm not saying that it's going to be a total solution to the problem, but if we can show some movement involving the international community, and with a very clear understanding that we don't want this to be used as an instrument for promoting radical Islamic extremism in or within Myanmar. Rohingyas as a people, yes, have been Islamic. They have lived peacefully. There have been these recent problems. But let us also not forget the radical Islamic influence which came in from Afghanistan to groups of Rohingyas. And to my mind, what happens in Afghanistan and the Afghanistan-Pakistan border now with the central government losing its authority, and this is again going to be a center for jihad worldwide. And these are issues we have to look after. But at least we can be seen to be moving in accommodating a small number, in smaller numbers, the Rohingyas to start with. It will make life easier for Sheikh Hasina, with whose government we have excellent relations. And therefore, one would like to see some progress. But it's not for India to sort of suggest what these to be. It is for the countries concerned to work it out. And to the West, please stop sermonizing and start looking for solutions. I mean, delivering sermons and seeming like great protectors of human rights when you're dealing with Kim Jong-un is hardly a measure of love for democracy worldwide in equitable manner.
There is one question from Ms. Tanisha Mitra. She's asking that in this world of multipolarity, and the world is going towards more and more multipolarity, will China be a part of that multipolarity, or will it try to dominate the multipolarity and make a hegemon power? Who would like to, any of your ambassadors would like to take that up?
Gautam, you can take it and I'll just...
Okay, sir. Look, even if China tries to be a hegemon, it is not going to be given a walkover. It's very simple. I think a hegemonistic tendency is there. Middle Kingdom tendency is there. But it is not in a position, while it talks a lot of comprehensive national power, it is not in a position to achieve that kind of hegemony, even despite the concentration of power that we have in the Communist Party and in the person of Xi Jinping. I would say that at this point of time, their primary objectives are to be able to establish what they are, which is hegemonistic, but is to establish their claims on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on South China Sea, and all their territorial disputes. China believes that what we call disputes are actually their lands, and that it wants to, at this point of time, simply dominate and achieve that. And of course, there is no question that in Asia, it would like to be able to establish that kind of hegemony where its power is unquestioned. But it has to deal with many other powers in Asia. It has to deal with Japan, which may not be a military power, but is a major economic power. It has to deal with Australia, which is an alliance partner, both Japan and Australia alliance partners of the United States. And the United States itself has shown some resolve, as we just discussed. And it has to deal with India, which is also, a major power in its own backyard. In fact, so I don't think even if it desires to be a hegemon, it will be able to achieve that. And this is where I think the project is destined towards, it is hubris. It is taking on more than you can want or achieve. And which is why I posed that question in the beginning. Is there essentially something inherent in the Chinese political character that seeks to be on top of a kind of power pyramid and exercises the use of power in all its relationships, even including its friends, and a relationship that does not accept a complete equality. Incidentally, Dipanjan, I noticed a few other questions that, I'm sorry, Ambassador Parthasarathy, in case you would like to add to that.
No, fine, I'm fine.
Ambassador Sajjanhar, who is a colleague of both of you, he has asked a pertinent question. He wonders when would India be able to move on these two projects, the trilateral highway and the Kaladan multimodal project. Would you like,
I can take that, sir, since I'm sort of more, okay. Look, in the case of the trilateral project, trilateral highway project, whatever problems are there, and this is something endemic to our system, are essentially just purely procedural and implementation related. But by and large, India has had a reasonably good record of completing its projects. And there is a lot of heartburn while the projects are stuck for a long time. But eventually when they are completed, everybody acknowledges that they were well intended and well meant. I think my bigger issue with the trilateral highway is that, all right, we'll build the highway. We will make it as a gesture to Myanmar, a development gesture. We will link to Southeast Asia. But have we thought enough in terms of how we are going to use that highway for our commercial objectives and for our strategic objectives. In the case of the Kaladan, it's slightly different. In the case of the Kaladan, and in a way this also impinges on a question that was asked by Jesudas Bell, which is on the use of ethnic insurgencies, whether China is using ethnic insurgencies against us in any way. Of course, historically they have used the Naga insurgency against us, and they have supported many other Northeast insurgencies. The specific case it comes to is on the case of the Kaladan project and the Arakan army, which I think is actually a bigger problem for us right now than ARSA immediately. I cannot rule it out. The timing of their so-called chief, General Tun Myat Nang, he gave an interview very recently where he basically gives notice to India that India should pay taxes for its Kaladan project. And the fact is that they, in a way, dominate or certainly are interfering with the project at the critical stage, you know, where the jetty, the inland water terminal goes on to the highway. As of now, we have begun the project, the road project from the north. So this will continue. But the fact is that we do face a security situation coming from the Arakan army on that project, which we'll have to see how we handle and how it plays out. Because one of the reasons that Min Aung Hlaing came out against, though he did not mention China, against China, was the suspicion that China is behind the Arakan army. And this is an aspect that the Arakan army has to clear up, because in many ways they have been grandfathered by China. They are a child of the Kachin independence army, who itself has been supported by China. Having said that, I'll still come back to my original qualification, that even if they are being used by China, we cannot assume that all these groups will necessarily lend themselves to China vis-a-vis third countries. They have their own nationalist objectives and their own political and military objectives, and we should keep that in mind. So there is a space where we should not write them off, and we have to think about how to deal with them. On Chofu, sorry, one question on Sajanhar, Ambassador Sajanhar's question. I think this is a very pertinent question. I would like to complete that by one more point. You know, I think we have not thought enough. We need alternative strategies to deal with our economic strategies to deal with Southeast Asia, to deal with Myanmar and Southeast Asia. I don't want to take too long on it, but let's just say very simply that we cannot compete with China on infrastructure, manufacturing, finance, real estate, sitting from India. If we have to do this, we have to invest in the ASEAN economic community from inside. And if we do so, we have cost, quality, technology, reliability that would work in our favor. And I would say that we should do what the Chinese are not doing. Chinese relationship is completely, economic relationship is completely extractive, completely neo-colonial, even when it goes down to agriculture. We should think of investing in the agri-rural sector of Myanmar, where 75% of people draw their livelihoods on. That means process their rice, process their beans and pulses, their oil seeds, and their mineral products, add value, create employment, generate entrepreneurship within particularly the CLMV countries, which have a development deficit. And a very important point that Ambassador Parthasarathy mentioned, the Vietnam connection. If we did that, we would have an economic link, very different from the Chinese link. An economic link at the level of people, at the level of SMEs, at the level of the farmers, at the level of rural population, all the way from the northeast of India terrestrially and from other areas through the maritime connection, all the way up to Vietnam. And the shortest route to Vietnam, in fact, is not through the trilateral highway, which goes through Thailand and eventually comes up in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But you can actually go to Vietnam, to Hanoi, directly from Mandalay through Laos, Luang Nam Tha, and enter Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. I've personally traversed this area, and essentially it is all agricultural territory. And if this is the strategy that we could adopt, I think it's not an answer to China's BRI, but it is part of a larger answer to China.
We're just running, but I'm going to take a very last question, and Ambassador Parthasarathy could answer that. Mr. Sudha Shah, she has asked, there was a member of parliament who was a Rohingya till 2016. So what really happened that they became so radical, is her question.
Well, really, radicalization starts with one thing, frustration. And secondly, the sort of company you keep. If your people backing you are radically inclined, that happens. So I would suggest that I go back to what I said earlier. The most dangerous thing would be the Rohingyas going back to their old habits of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. That would be a real problem even for us when they go back through Indian territory. So I think the most important thing in dealing with it has got to be some way of working it with Bangladesh that they don't get out in that direction towards the Afghanistan border. Otherwise, radicalization is not that difficult. But again, I go back to a very basic thing. I would think they should at least start in some small way, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and perhaps, and I look further. If China is so well, let India and China join together and provide enough food grains and other support for just a pilot project to start with, and then move ahead with UN and international support. That is the way of doing it. Passing judgment and criticizing Aung San Suu Kyi or General Manong Lang is not going to lead anywhere, and the West should be told that.
Thank you, Mr. Parthasarathy. Thank you, Mr. Mukhopadhaya. We had a really enriching session. 1 hour is not enough to understand, to discuss, such a complicated country like Myanmar, one of India's critical neighbors. And as you said, the Indian Army has the best of relations with the Myanmar Army. On that happy note, I would like to thank both of you and all the participants who took interest in which is otherwise an offbeat subject in India's foreign policy and strategic thinking. Thank you once again for joining the Ananta Center's webinar series. We look forward to your participation till the next time.
Thank you, Dipanjan.
Thank you.
So, Gautam and all the...
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Master.
Thank you, Dipanjan. Thank you, Kiran.
Thank
Good
you.
day. Bye.